In the last episode of Investigations, we talked about the way that people tend to conceptualize life as an object rather than a process, and the ways in which that creates problems for understanding A, where life comes from, and B, what is consciousness. Today, I wanted to see if we could figure out a little bit more about the implications that seeing life as a state of matter rather than as an object has on what's called the hard problem of consciousness. We've been dealing a lot with the hard problem of consciousness because we had Yosha Bach on the show, we had Ogi Ogus, and it seems like there's two schools of thought. There is a hard problem of consciousness, and that there is not a hard problem of consciousness.
Well, let's be completely frank. We invited Yosha Bach to come and explain to us why there is a hard problem of consciousness, and this episode seemed to make people really angry. Finally, somebody said to me, well, just because you have a perfect mechanistic correlation doesn't mean you can explain the problem. And I think that this is the fundamental disagreement, because in science, the best thing we can hope for is a mechanistic explanation for the production of phenomena.
Well, let's be clear about this. The problem appears to be, how is it that we have experience rather than not experience? This is the philosophical zombie, where somebody reaches out and touches a frying pan that's hot, and they pull their hand away, and they act as if they're in pain, but there's not any kind of internal state of pain that's real. And so because that you can imagine this kind of weird philosophical zombie, you have a hard problem of consciousness.
But can you imagine such a weird philosophical zombie? This is where I'm having trouble, is if something looks like it is so, and it acts like it is so, and it says that it is so, then what is not conscious about this entity?
To steelman the point,
Yes, please.
I think that people are like, why do you have an emotional reaction to things? Why do you have all of these complex feelings where when you're walking down a street and it's a beautiful day and the sun hits you in just the right way, you get this feeling of just the ecstasy of being alive? It seems entirely possible that you could survive without that. And so how do you develop such a complex...
I don't think you could survive without that, is the thing. I don't think that any of our perceptions are accidental. For instance, our ability to see color is quite unique in the animal kingdom, the degree to which we can do it, but it's also essential to us navigating the human landscape. If you think about just driving down the street without color, it would be tremendously difficult.
Or even picking out the foods to eat, because your apple that's still green is not the same as the apple that's red. And you have to be able to look at the tree and say, I'm going to take the red apple and not the green apple, because the person who takes the green apples exclusively is going to have stomach aches and isn't going to be able to eat properly.
And walking in the sun feels good because it is good for you, is the thing, right? We're discovering, vitamin D deficiency. There's reasons that being in the sun feels good. There's reasons that all the things that feel good to you, right? And, people might bring up, oh, well, what about drugs that make you feel good? Well, they make you feel really bad the next day, is the thing, right? So they don't really make you feel good on balance. I think any drug addict would be happy to volunteer this information. So you are fundamentally oriented towards things that provide for your success in the physical landscape. And what more is necessary? From the simplest organism, a bacterium, it's also oriented towards the things that are good for its success in its own role.
Well, the problem is that there doesn't seem to be a model for the internal state of the bacteria. Like let alone the human, but when we were talking to Bach, he was like, there's no evidence that the bacteria has an internal experience. I find it hard to believe that the electrochemical state inside of the cell is not already the most rudimentary possible form of good and bad, right? Because bacteria have this thing called redox stress. Inside of your cells, you have a set point for the electrochemical conditions. You have to have a balance between oxidized and reduced species of all of these different compounds. And what these are is that there's these little molecules of electrical exchange inside of your metabolic system. And what they're doing is they're taking the activity in one side of the cell and they're bringing it to another side of the cell and allowing that distal part of the cell to do work.
But fundamentally, you have a primitive reward circuit.
Which is that you want to keep this within balance. And so the bacterium innately must feel a sense of this is the set point, and what I must do is I must maintain my internal set point. And there's not a sense of I am a bacterium and this is my job. It's just on the level of this doesn't feel good in the most rudimentary electrical way. Like I imagine that if I could shrink myself down to bacteria and experience redox stress, it would be pain.
Because what is pain and what is stress in the human landscape from an emotional standpoint, if not an incongruence between your expectations and what is happening in the world to you? Right?
Your expectation of set point, right? You're like, I want my internal set point to be like this, whether that's mood or nutrients or salt
I have a girlfriend
levels.
and all of a sudden I don't because she dumped me. Well, that's very chaotic and disturbing because it moves you away from that set point.
Exactly. And so all of our complex modules about consciousness emerge, I think, pretty straightforwardly from this most basic bacterial cell. And the problem is that the people who are preoccupied with the hard problem of consciousness universally seem to think that the bacteria don't have that kind of internal state because there isn't a neurotransmitter brain-like system that would allow the bacteria to feel. And so we have a tendency of looking at thoughts and feelings as being emergent from the neural structures that allow us to experience something, because we experience things in this very complex way. And so we assume that that must be the minimum unit that is necessary to experience things. Like during the conversation, Yosha confessionally was like, I think my cat is conscious.
Yeah, can I throw one more metaphysical level on this?
Yeah.
I think that this is a really old prejudice that humans have had, that dates back to religious practice, where animals are both deified but seen as separate. And if you look into pre-Renaissance Catholic vision, they essentially came up with this idea that animals are not conscious, right? And so I guess what I was trying to say was that this idea that humans are separate and special is relatively modern in my reading of the history of the world. And I think that that's a little bit of a misconception because, of course, humans have this unique ability to look at themselves and make decisions about who they could be in the future versus the past. There's something about time that's really special with humans, but animals are very complex. Their consciousness is undoubtedly complex, and I think that some of the classic ancestors of antiquity understood this better than we do about animals, to the point that they venerated them and held them, in some sense, higher than humans, because their autonomy seems to be perfected to such a degree, whereas humans are kind of lost at times. You don't really see that in the animal kingdom. So I still don't understand why there's a hard problem of consciousness when we have a mechanistic explanation for the production of consciousness.
And I think that I've gotten a little bit closer to understanding it. I think the roots of this discourse come down to trying to program a conscious entity. People are trying to understand what it is that makes something conscious and human-like. And I think that what is required is that you would have to have a robot with an artificial consciousness that performed all of the functions of life, that it was able to then go out and make more of itself, and that next generation would be able to make its own decisions and progressively become different from what it was 10 generations ago, 100 generations ago, 1,000 generations ago. And so if you had a robot that could play that game, conscious. If your robot looks to you constantly and is like, what do I do?
How do I feel?
How do I feel? Probably not conscious. And I think that that's where the core of it lies. It's, can we make machines that are capable of this? And I'm like, yes, if they're living.
Have a baby.
All right. I think that covers it. We'll deal with the other questions next time.